All right, well, I think we'll make a start. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a cold Melbourne winter's night. It's the 12th of June, and by way of introduction, we are the Atheist Society in Melbourne, and we don't actually have any formal members, but we do have a mailing list for reminders for our lectures, which are both in the hall here and on Zoom. And tonight, we are to welcome uh, a speaker who hasn't actually uh, given a presentation here before, but has been a very long-term attendee, uh, Steve Higson, who is the convener of the Sea of Faith in Melbourne. So we would like to welcome Steve. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you're all gathered to here tonight, and we'll talk about our favourite subject, the Great Spirit. Looking back at history, unfortunately, not many people look at history. After a while, it starts to hit you that there were thousands of years of people believing in spirits. But the curious thing is how they went from very small spirits, like in the cult of Atheism, they believed that there were spirits in rocks and spirits in trees and spirits at the bottom of the garden if they had one. Then the spirits started to get bigger. They grew into the polytheistic gods. You started to have, a god of the sea, or you had a Zeus up on the mountain throwing lightning bolts. So they got gods. There's a number of gods, and they'd gotten a bit larger. And then amazingly, in classical times, we started to get this one big God, which hasn't quite taken over all the world yet. So we had a long tradition of people believing in spirits. And then this all-pervading, all-powerful God took over much of the world, or this belief in such. And then in recent times, at least in the Western world, has lost popularity. But do we still have a spirit? Do atheists still have a spirit? Or do they believe in a spirit? And looking back at all this, I was just rather shocked that people would so intensely believe, like in the Middle Ages, their whole life was dominated by God from, when they woke up until they went to sleep, and then they might dream about him occasionally. Every second of the day had God in it. And there was an army of priests making sure that you didn't wander from that comprehension. Anyway, my talk was originally titled The Medieval God, the Cosmic Dictator, because it was particularly in the Middle Ages that this all-powerful God was created, which became a dictator of the spirit. Now, I might start off by pointing out my description of the medieval or monotheistic God as a cosmic dictator is not a pejorative. I know for many of you atheists it would be, but not for me. I don't mind dictators actually sometimes. We derive the term dictator from the Roman Republic. It was normally ruled by two consuls who could veto each other. This was designed to protect Rome's constitution by preventing too much power being concentrated in a single individual. But in difficult times, the Romans appointed a single dictator to avoid debilitating indecision. So dictator itself is neutral, and one can have a good dictator or a bad dictator. Indeed, the medieval God is one that is seen as dictating both the external laws of physics and our internal values at the same time. As the philosopher Kant, in his Dichotomy, pointed to the external majesty of the cosmos against the moral law within. So we had both external physics and our internal morals were dictated by the same God. But this absolute cosmic dictator is most peculiar because the spirituality that preceded monotheism was transactional rather than dictatorial. The new absolute God wanted for nothing. because he was the creator and commander of all things. He didn't need man, but out of the kindness of his heart, he would receive man's love. But how did we get there? How did man change? Why did he progress from the primitive hunter-gatherer who felt his existence with nature was transactional to one of imposition by an absolute God? We start off in life with mystery, the dichotomy of nature and mind. We perceive objective objects in the external world. We call this matter. And behind our eyes is another world, a mind, something that is loosely referred to as spirit. Now, if we didn't have a reflexive mind, we wouldn't project spirit onto existence. This is the last frontier because here science doesn't have all the answers. As yet, this is the last outpost of the supernatural. As a child living 60 years ago in Australia with a strong sentimental attachment to the waning Christian tradition, one was still presented with the concept of an all-powerful God, a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, a creator and sustainer of the cosmos. As a child, one blindly accepts the culture that is handed down, whether it is the age-old traditions of the Anglo-Saxon adventure or the Christian God that the Anglo-Saxons embraced during the Dark Ages at the behest of the Franks. Indeed, here we have two aspects of a spiritual culture, that of the philosophizing priestly class and that of the heroic traditions in the adventure of nation. As a child, one believes the material world is imbued with an all-knowing, pervasive, traditional spirit. This spirit is perceived as the highest of all beings, the creator of everything around itself and ever present in all places. God is imagined as always watching over every action, both good and evil, a God who knows the very contents of one's mind. This belief system shares much in common with the absolutist Stasi state of East Germany. Indeed, for the fading but still respected Christianity of the free world, the existential fear of the godless Red Terror of the communists who had overtaken a third of the world at the time looms large. History arrived at the concept of an all-powerful God, and we became inheritors of this idea. However, history argues that this was not always the case. Primitive societies engaged in practices centered upon anism, clan totems, and general nature worship. These systems left little room for a dictatorship of the spirit. The next step in spiritual development is evident in the hierarchical parthenons of agricultural societies. Natural phenomena such as the ocean, perceived as possessing supernatural force, evolved into theistic concepts. For instance, the Greek deity Poseidon emerged as an anthropomorphic god of the sea. Similarly, the agricultural goddess Demeter reflected the cycles of nature. Her happiness manifested in summer and in bountiful harvest, her sadness in the barrenness of winter. It would not be hard to imagine the ancient sailor feeling the intensity of the barrenness of intensity of the ocean expanse. One might find a sense of security in making friends with the god Poseidon that ruled this part of nature. The surety of the friendly invisible hand while he navigated the dangerous waters. I mean, if I was stuck out in the ocean, I'd be freaking out if I was on a small wooden boat. I'd really want a big, powerful God to be protecting me. It's a real sucker's sell, I reckon. You're just not going to say no. But again, what was the scope for the dictatorship of the spirit within pagan polytheistic parthenons? Zeus and his divine brethren were powerful but not omnipotent. Transformed from elemental deities of nature, they were amorphized into a cosmic set of princely figures who defeated the giants, who defeated the brutal giants that preceded them. Zeus ruled more often through arbitration and consultation than through decree and force. Now, as Kenneth Smith aptly points out, this is a contemporary philosopher who I follow in the Zoom group once a week. He has a small but rather intense following. And he is interesting, but just not as well known as perhaps he should be. As Kenneth Smith aptly points out, Greek, in quotes, Greek polytheism is intensely moral, concentrated upon soulcraft or self-cultivation. At the same time, it conceives humans to be radically self-governing for better or worse. Like every natural being, they have an impulse of self-direction that is the very quintessence of their nature, which not even the gods in their authority deem it right to overwhelm or violate. As Nietzsche precipitously remarked, no Greek god ever told a Greek, thou shalt. The religion of the Hebrews had its origins in the Canaanite polytheism. Like other Parthenons, it presented a number of gods within a narrative structure. The chief god El was paired with his divine consort, Asherah. Together they had a multitude of children, including Yahweh and Baal. At some points in the Hebrew tradition, Yahweh supplanted El, taking Asherah as his consort. Yahweh was a storm and rain god, a creator god. He did not create ex nihilo, that is, out of nothing, but rather brought order to a primordial chaos of waters, reflecting his origins as a nature deity. According to legend, about 2100 BC, the prophet Abraham left the city of Ur, seeking his God in the wilderness. At the same time, gods were associated with their centres of worship. Upon entering the territory, one might become subject to the god or gods of that place. Abraham, however, was guided by Yahweh to Palestine, where he set up altars to sanctify the land for his God. The Bible, written during the Babylonian captivity, claims that this marked the beginning of Hebrew monotheism, yet evidence suggests that Yahweh continued to be worshipped alongside his consort, children, and possibly other gods. A practice that persisted to some degree until the Babylonian captivity. Scholars believe that to varying degrees, the Hebrews practice henotheism, focusing on the worship of a preferred god while still acknowledging the potential existence and worship of other gods within a Parthenon. Even the Old Testament itself is suggestive of monolatry, the exclusive worship of one god without denying the existence of others. One thing seems probable. Okay, lost my place there. One thing seems probable. Yahweh is not the absolute God we have later. He is a transactional God. Abraham had a contract. In return for worship, Abraham and his tribe will prosper. It is with the line of the Old Testament prophets that we begin to see strict monotheism that we are familiar with today. One theory attributes this shift to the impact of the Assyrian Empire. While there had been large states before, such as the faltering Akkadian Empire that Abraham had left behind, the Assyrian Empire was something novel. Emerging during the Axial Age, a hotbed of new ideas, the Assyrians pioneered tools of empire that would later be adopted by various successors. Previous kingdoms would defeat an enemy and demand a steady stream of tribute. The Assyrians, however, deposed kings, replacing them with governors and garrisons. The leadership of troublesome populations was deported to other parts of the empire, a strategy that consolidated their control. When we reflect on the history of the ancient Middle East, it is tempting to lump it all together. From the pharaohs and their pyramids to the Sumerian god kings and their ziggurats, until the Greeks seemingly appear around 500 BC, ushering in a new age we call the Axial Age. Yet this new age likely began much earlier with the Phoenicians around 1000 BC. The critical feature of this era was the rise of burgeoning international trade, which demanded new levels of sophistication in record keeping and thought. Prior to this, foreign trade had been a smaller scale affair and done through the office of the monarch. Abraham was probably a trader as well as a herder, visits a pharaoh directly, but now international markets were starting to take on a life of their own. While the Phoenicians and Greeks were busy colonising the Mediterranean, a new type of empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, emerged. Empires existed for one primary purpose: to protect and profit from international trade routes. The Greeks were the inheritors of a transformation that had been unfolding for centuries. The Axial Age ushered in a new rational system of thought. The old way of viewing the gods was seen as childish. An age of scepticism created doubts about the old mythologies. This was to be instrumental in the rise of monotheism's cosmic dictator, because over the comedies of the old gods, this new god appealed to the relative reason, the reason of that age. I mean, the old gods were just starting to look silly, and the monotheists came up with their new fangled god, which, oh yeah, this one seems sensible. And of course, people beg to differ these days. So how did this Copernican turn of the spirit come about in the minds of men like Socrates? A sophisticated and highly developed pre-axial age culture, similar to the pyramid building Egypt, is still with us in the Americas merely half a millennia ago. To comprehend just how transactional pre-monotheistic religion was, the Aztecs believed their gods must be appeased with countless human sacrifices. Otherwise, the sun would go dark and the cosmos would fail without the aid of the gods to keep it going. Asher was increasingly envisioned as ruling over all the lands conquered by the Assyrian army. The Assyrian royal theology introduced the idea of one universal imperial king and one universal imperial god. Not merely Asher fighting alongside the Assyrian kings, but ruling over the vast territories that were never originally tied to the Assyrian royalty or their divine geographical mandate. This significant theological innovation left a profound impression on the surrounding regions. Okay, I've ended my quote there and speaking in what I wrote. I've been writing there. This innovation seems to have influenced the Hebrew prophets, who re-envisioned their God Yahweh as a universal deity. After all, it would have hardly sufficed for their God to appear subordinate to the Assyrian god Ashur. In Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, Yahweh is portrayed as ruling over the minds of even foreign princes, governing all space and knowing everything that is hidden. Here we see the transition of Yahweh into a universal God, facing the challenge of the imperial god Ashur Marduk. The profound lines 5, 6, and 7 from Isaiah 45 state, 5, I am the Lord and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee and thou hast not known me. Number 6, that they may know from the rising of the sun from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord and there is nothing else. Number 7, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. This is sort of an extraordinary set of lines that started to appear in the Bible, because the earlier Yahweh didn't originally, or we don't believe, made such intense claims. But now it's been laid down. I am the power over everything. It's, of course, the curious thing for us that this God doesn't have a corresponding equally powerful evil God. It's the creator of all, so it's the creator of all good and all evil. The Assyrian Empire falls and is quickly replaced by the Babylonian Empire, which was essentially the Assyrian Empire under new management. The kingdom of Israel had been destroyed by the Assyrians, and the Babylonians brought destruction to Judea, carting off the Hebrew leadership in the famous Babylonian captivity. Dr. Justin Sledge aptly captures this transformation, and quoting him again, with the imperial theological innovations of the Assyrians and their universalizing god Ashur, the Israelites were able to continue expanding the mythological power of their god. This path had already been blazed by the Assyrians. The Assyrian theologians may have been the first to conceive of a universal god, still a god among other gods, but a truly formidable one, now freed from regional or shrine-specific limitations. However, it wouldn't be a powerful empire that solidified this universality. Instead, it would be a kingdom rising from the ashes of exile that brought monotheism to fruition. The Hebrew leadership remained captive in Babylon for 65 years, from 605 BC to 540 BC. Then the Persians famously allowed them to return to their Holy Land. These years of exile forged a strong identity and faith among the Hebrews, far from their rustic homeland. One might assume this resulted in a rigid devotion to doctrine. During this period, the Old Testament was formally compiled and arguably rewritten with a pure monotheism extending back to Abraham. Fast forward to the European world in the West, where Platonism introduced the idea that behind the appearances of earthly forms lies a perfect transcendental world of forms. The most perfect form, according to Platonism, is the one, or the good. Logical, perhaps, according to Plato. However, Plato's God was a deistic God, not the intervening type of God described in the Bible. Yet the revamped Judaism that became Christianity was strongly influenced by Platonism. Finally, after centuries of persecution, the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the imperial creed. An imperial God for an empire. One God, one emperor, one empire. As Constantine proclaimed overnight, Christianity inherited a significant portion of the earth. Similarly, Islam, another offshoot, gained a vast following. The concept of the one and only God spread far and wide. The dawn of the Middle Ages saw this universal God becoming dominant doctrine over much of the earth, a God uncompromised by man or nature, subjugating all creation, the cosmic dictator. Such a religion has a strong selling point for the Roman masses seeking salvation in this world or the next. The imperfect pagan gods would no longer suffice. What's the point of good works throughout one's life to secure a place in heaven, only to end up in hell due to a glitch in the less than perfect bureaucracy of the pagan gods? Only a perfect God would offer a perfect guarantee. Now I turn to the words of Kenneth Smith again, and this is what intrigued me about this whole concept. The American philosopher who inspired the concept of the cosmic dictator, the omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. This is quite a stretch of an abstract idea, whether it is real or simply a fairy tale. And here I quote Kenneth Smith. Medieval civilization is a regime of the principle of spirit. Spirit is a metaphysically peculiar principle, classically defined as actus purus. I won't explain that one. I don't think I remember it quite that well. Or activity untainted by any passivity or suffering. All that is in nature acts and is acted upon in a dialectic or reciprocation, a relativity of priority. To be natural in nature to be natural is to be marked by liabilities, the necessities or needs, as well as powers and instincts for self-providence. But spirit is the idea of absolute or unencumbered power, unconditioned by and abstracted from the web of natural transactions. The God Christianity conceived of is a sole and solitary authority, a sovereign who acts on unilateral initiative, who is bound by no higher or lower order, owes nothing and needs nothing. All creatures he made have specific instincts and motives driving their actions. But God alone is free in the ultimate sense. His power is infinite, unbounded by any rival principle, unconfined by any inner nature of his own, in the sense of a nature coordinated with and subject to an order of nature outside. And his power is capable of any effect. It is omnipotent. The self-sufficiency and self-rule that the Greek aristocracy took as the highest state for the exceptional humans is to strive for, exemplified not just by the Olympians, but also by every animal's instinctual self-conduct, has become the exclusive prerogative of this God alone, who possesses it in a superlative degree. Under the new theological premise, nothing in nature accounts for itself. Nothing is strictly natural, self-active, or self-evolving. The Greek gods had co-evolved along with the natural order, which was their matrix too. But all of nature is now seen as architected and harmonized by God. Under the Christian regime, nature has an altogether different status as a divine work of art. Unlike the human artisan who takes for granted a pre-existing material on which he works some modifications, the Creator God assumes nothing. He brings into existence out of a nugatory nothingness both the form and matter of the cosmos and his creatures. Just pure activity of spirit implies organicism, instinctual self-providence, intuitive sense of what is good, teleology, and all that now describes God's dispensation. The system he ordained and sustains for the benefit of his creaturely children. It is God's edict, his preferred style, that form and matter are in every case married as they are. The authority of nature over itself is ultimacy or irreducibility has been deposed. What was once the very sun is now a satellite of another principle, with no natural derivation or explanation can be given. A sort of flabbergasting that man went from a naturalist spiritual, finish with Kenneth Smith's quote, sort of flabbergasting that man went from a naturalist spiritual condition in progressive steps to find themselves under the all-pervading dictatorship of the spirit. I think I've demonstrated that to varying degrees, the monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are dominated by the dictatorship of the spirit, even though some transactional elements might remain. Christianity and its priesthood achieved unparalleled power. It threatened and potentially overthrew emperors, let alone kings. One of the fine early examples was the submission of the Roman Emperor Theodosius I to achieve power in 379 AD. It was this emperor who finally enforced Orthodox Catholicism as the single state religion and augmented the final destruction of the pagan establishment. At the best of times, one didn't want to cross a Roman emperor, but Theodosius more so than most. The city of Thessalonica crossed him, so he had a good chunk of the city's men, women, and children massacred. This outraged Saint Ambrose. At the time, Christian bishops and patriarchs generally dressed in poor, simple clothing to emphasise their humility, unlike the church prelates of millennia later who outraged the Franciscans. Ambrose blocked the doors of the church to the richly clad Theodosius and the imperial entourage. But the earthly dictator Theodosius was forced to retreat and humiliate himself before the visible servant of the invisible cosmic dictator. But let's turn our minds to the ongoing fall of the church of the cosmic dictator that began in modern times. Probably the single most significant moment was the publication of Sir Isaac Newton's The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy in 1687. The former cosmic conception had relied on the manifestation of a prime mover. Well, this was the original, whether you went for the Ptolemaic system of the heavens or the Copernican system. What made it move? What made the planets go around in cycle? What made all the gears go? It had to have, at its base, one final movement where you went no further. There was one prime mover, one spring in the universe which wound up itself. And as far as the church was concerned, this was the hand of God, proof that God existed. And this is why Newton, without intending it at all, undermined the whole, the church's concept of the heavens, because he realised gravity as being the force that made the heavens move, along with various other forces in physics. The former cosmic conception had relied on the manifestation of a prime mover, an uncaused cause that set the cosmos in motion. For the church, this was the hand of God, just as it had been for the Aztecs, who must please their cosmic hosts with human sacrifice. But the concept of gravity had taken the place of the prime mover. God's services were no longer required in the Enlightenment age. God might have existed and set the ball rolling, but in the deistic outlook, the cosmos and life could continue without the ever-present hand of God. Well, you just don't need God anymore. He might have been there in the past, but hell, I'm going on with my life. It's there. I don't need to worry about anything that's moving. The cosmic dictator could pack his bags and leave. The new absolute was now the absolute monarch. But soon the educated common men of the Enlightenment were demanding rule with an even newer absolute reason. This followed the Absolutes Committee and the Absolute Public. Since the French Revolution, many absolutist regimes have risen and fallen. The absolute scientific conception follows with the absolute answers. So the absolute God, if you're a bit weary, I've reached the last page, is gone. But the absolute dictatorship of the cult of reason has continued the regime of the absolute spirit without the God conception that had originally inspired it. This is the interesting thing, that you go to very ancient times and people didn't think in absolutes. Then in the age of Greek philosophy, Plato, we start to find them thinking in absolutes, and they create an absolute God. Well, he terrorised the inhabitants of half the world for about 1,000 years or more, and the God is kicked out of the brew, and yet thought continues with absolutism. I think it's something to be wary of when people say absolutely all the time, when they agree with you absolutely and say things must be absolute in a certain way. Well, the absolute world conception that this God entailed, we had this absolute God. He commands everything. If you're in your medieval village, the priest is whipping your back, making sure that you're not thinking the wrong thoughts from, sun up to night, and then during the night, this God's all around you. It's watching what you're doing. Got to be careful where you put your hands, because this God knows everything that's going on in your head. This is what kids were taught in recent times, weren't they? Pretty scary, huh? For some people. But this tendency to think in terms of this absolute God, and you've got this whole absolute structure, what happens is the God is kicked out, but the absolute reasoning continues, which had surrounded this God. The God's gone, but thought in absolutes in philosophy continues. You might say so much of our culture is a product of Christianity. So we've booted out the God, but we still have much of the culture. Well, I'll continue. We have gone full circle. The atheist is still stuck with the dichotomy of matter and spirit, the visceral body and the rational mind. So the ghost in the brain is still with us. The existential challenge remains how to live with the spirit of the mind. What do I do with my mental impressions, feelings, and ideas when I've discovered I'm merely the descendant of apes? When I find my cherished ideals and values are simply sublimations of natural instincts and animal machinery? What is the point of compassion when I discover the feeling is a spiritual fraud? Should I care anymore? Now that the atheist spirit prevails, what answers for man can come from the atheist perspective? With the supposed God, the churchman felt there was a guarantee for his invisible subjective values and his moral ideas. Nietzsche, the philosopher, in his passage on the madman, warned that God is dead, meaning there is no longer an underpinning for the subjective values like general concepts of good and evil. Anyway, to finish off, I'll mention the word of one atheist in this brave new world of atheism, your favourite, Sam Harris, I suppose. I'll introduce a recent conversation between Jaron Lowenstein and Sam Harris. Sam sees profound difficulties for face in a post-God world. All right, starting off with Jaron Lowenstein. Quotes, you know, as somebody who was a former practicing Jew, I've said this before, I really miss the community and there's just nothing that's replaced it for me. And Sam Harris replies, well, I do think there's a void and we need to fill it. But the question is fill it with something better and more reasonable, not intrinsically divisive and not intellectually embarrassing, that doesn't require any lies to oneself or one's children. At this point, Sam replies to Jaron on whether the new style Christianity is redeemable. Sam concludes in the negative, and here I quote him again. I mean, listen, it takes 15 seconds to drill down in a conversation with any Christian to get to the crazy part. If there is no crazy part, then it really isn't fulfilling. Okay, hopefully. I mean, it takes 15 seconds to drill down in a conversation with any Christian to get to the crazy part. If there's no crazy part, then it really isn't fulfilling. If there is no crunchy centre or chewy centre of the Tootsie Pop, if there's no chewy centre of superstition and otherworldliness and the expectation of redemption after death, there has to be something magic in there. Otherwise, we're just talking about who's going to bring the egg salad for the picnic. Can we figure out some other way to picnic? I mean, you're tailgating for God here. You're tailgating for eternity. And that's what makes it especially meaningful. Sam Harris's questions might need some more polish. Well, thank you very much. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time.
Thank you very much, Steve. No, you certainly didn't take up too much of our time, and it was a very edifying, interesting talk. Just to make some points about the Atheist Society, we're very welcome to use this hall, but we would like to express our gratitude to the Unitarians. So if you do have the ability to make any contribution, we have a cup which we're going to pass around. And then we'll leave that for the benefit of the Unitarians in the hall. Just some other things I'd like to mention before we go on to questions, and just like to mention that there are other activities that take place, like lectures and meetings, the humanists and the skeptics in Melbourne. And there's also the Sea of Faith that has lectures, and we also have quite a few other social activities of the humanists and the atheists at twice a month at the Elsternwick Hotel, and other activities on the weekend. So you can find a lot of them on Meetup, or otherwise just ask to be informed, and you can find out about the dates of these events. Okay, we'll go to questions from the audience first, and then after that, if there's any questions from the people on the Zoom, maybe you can put up your hand, or put that symbolic hand up. I've got a comment or a question to start the ball rolling. Yeah, I've just started to resume reading through that book by George Fraser called The Golden Bough, which is when it came out in early 1900s. It was a kind of a trailblazing type of work. It goes into particularly the historical nature, which you started off talking about. For most of human history, we have believed in all sorts of spirits and magic. It is particularly relevant to all sorts of tribal beliefs. And it was very, very dominant. People their lives were dominated by these beliefs, and it was very fearful. What do you think about this proposition that if we look at a progression, then from tribal religions to tribal beliefs to religions to a sort of universal sense of reason and the scientific mode of thought is the ultimate end of that transition? But we haven't quite got there yet. So what do you think about that?
Well, I feel the problem is this, that reason, well, you're just dealing with human minds. So for the believer in the olden times, or there's still a few of them around today, felt that there was this being or beings above them who were, let's say, smarter, and they could work out all the nitty gritty. So this poor little creature running around on Earth with its circumscribed sense of reason, could be given a helping hand by this vastly greater being who had a vastly greater mind. And that's what I see as the problem. If I look at other humans and another human comes up and says, well, this is reason, and I might disagree, and I'll say, well, look, you're just a human. How can you tell me what to do? I've learned that I'm a descendant of the apes. I'm just a natural animal, and I'm there fighting for my bit of turf, my chunk of the earth. See, I see we are creatures, or this is what Nietzsche would claim with his sort of Darwinistic outlook, that we might be peaceable at times, and we might be peaceable to our own advantage with our own particular tribe or social group. But at the end of the day, there is always this element in us that wants to conquer the world. You can certainly see this in Islam, big time, that wants to expand. And it might not be always activated. We can be passive participants in a tribe and just happy as long as the tribe itself or its leaders expand in the world. Can we get along with universal reason? Well, this was Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer famously became an obvious public atheist without the authorities banging on his door. Maybe he was just too scary an individual for the authorities to come up to. Famously, the first Doctor Who, William Hartnell, I think it was, modelled himself upon Schopenhauer. So he was an intimidating person, even though he was short. Schopenhauer himself felt, religion is rubbish. I don't actually like the word religion. I prefer to use faith, but he said that sort of faith, that supernatural faith is rubbish. We don't need it anymore. We have philosophy. So that's, I suppose that'd be the position you announce, that somehow reasoning philosophy can replace the old belief. Nietzsche, well, I think this was pursued by Feuerbach as well and David Strauss, but Nietzsche at first agreed with him and then thought, no, this doesn't quite work. I think he said the reason was that people needed the good lie. They needed to believe that there was some all-powerful being in the universe. But most of all, and this is the really important ingredient, they needed to believe that their ideals, their values and their moral values were certified by some being vastly greater than themselves. And he felt over time, society would start to devolve. It would become nihilistic. Anyway, I hope I've answered your question. Okay, we have one in the online audience. Oh, okay, Angelina, you want to say something?
Yes, I'm not sure if everyone can hear me. Thank you for throwing light on that particular topic. A lot of food for thought. I wanted to just make two statements quickly, just maybe two aspects that I had some problems with, and then my question, if that's okay. I hope the audience can hear me. Firstly, I mean, about the Hebrews and the ancient Hebrews, if you want to call them that. I mean, in the Torah, it's stated that they actually came from Ur in Mesopotamia. That's one comment I just wanted to make about that they're most likely indigenous to Iraq as other Semitic people, but that's something else. We can argue about that in terms of cultural anthropology, etc. The other point was actually about, Islam kind of lacking some, I don't know, it's kind of implied here, criticism or self-analysis or being, I don't know what exactly, but I mean, I live in an Islamic country, firstly, and I'm not a Muslim. But secondly, I mean, there is a huge cultural tradition and intellectual tradition in Islam. The most famous one I can think of that comes to mind is the kind of debates between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rashid in Andalus, Tahafut al-Tahafut, which translates as, well, Tahafut al-Falsafa, which Ghazali wrote, which is basically the incoherence of the philosophers, and then Ibn Rashid kind of wrote a response, Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of incoherency, right? And I mean, there are many critics prior to that. So, and there are certain critics, even surprisingly enough, in Saudi Arabia, a country I don't really like, but there are also famous critics. So that's just something else I wanted to put out there because there seems to be a bit of misinformation. But my question was about this. You said something really interesting about the godless society of the communists. And could you say something about the fact that, yes, it was godless society in the sense of they didn't have this cosmic dictator, but they just replaced it with a dictator who was still possessed some cosmic attributes, let's say. I mean, the cult of personality in communist societies, in the art, theatre. And I also wanted to say, I mean, yes, they kind of removed temples, if you like, from day-to-day life, but it's quite well known and quite spoken of among literary scholars or theatre scholars from Eastern Europe that basically they had this culture of like temple of culture, they call it, dvarets kulturi. So I was wondering if you could say something about that the communists just kind of replaced one phallus with another phallus, if you agree with that or not.
Yes, that was my point, that we had the absolute God of the Middle Ages, and we had this absolutist structure in our thought around this absolute God. I mean, this was a very different world from, say, Egypt before they built the pyramids, or even Egypt after they built the pyramids. I often read the story of Sinaway, which was before the Axial Age, to see that there was a profoundly different mind to what we encountered in the Axial Age and our successive epoch. They didn't tend to think in absolutes. They were far more realistic. We are the ones that are thinking in terms of these humongous abstractions. This is something that's come from this medieval age. And we have continued with the medieval absolutism. And so the French Revolution was something that was behaving in an absolute, well, you had the absolute monarch before that. They displaced the absolute monarch with the absolute committee ruling over the absolute human being inside the state and the absolute states. So, I mean, what was, many of the communist countries, they were absolutist states that believed, just like was thought of as the medieval God, would rule over every aspect of your life. I assume there were a few positives there that the West didn't have. There always are. In regards to Islam, well, Islam did for a long time have a more sort of enlightened thought life. Strangely enough, somehow it was in the 18th century that a more extreme, narrow-minded form of Islam started to rise. Curiously, this was at the same time the Christians were beginning their revivalism. There was something about modern thought, the modern world, the modern technologies that were coming along that was disturbing the religious mind. I think famously, I think it was Descartes who created the basis of ballistics. And in the Ottoman Empire, the Emmans reviewed the science of ballistics as being ungodly, leading to the Ottoman Empire having an enormously bad time using its cannons in comparison to the way the Europeans were learning to use them and doing pinpoint attacks. So because this is a point, this huge empire, which was pretty sophisticated materially, it was probably the place to live, in the 17th century, it would probably beat living in Europe. And yet they said, science of ballistics? No way. I don't know. I'll have to meditate on it. What was it about the science of ballistics which annoyed them? Certainly there would have been something in the Newtonian conception of the world, and that is they had removed the prime mover from the cosmic conception. Now it was just material laws. This is perhaps quite rightly, they were disturbed by this idea. Well, if you bury your head in the sand, the evil science and technology and the science of causation will go away, because all these things concerns causations. Ancient man asked what caused things. Well, what made the plants grow? The little fairies in the bottom of the garden. What created the world? Some powerful nature god. These were the causes. For Constantine, Emperor Constantine must have been a pretty smart guy, but he was limited by his understanding of causation. He looked at the big world. Yeah, God must have made it. What's happened in the last few centuries is the science of causation. For example, what is governing the journey of the planets in the sky? What is creating the solar system and for them, the cosmic spheres? The law of gravity. You no longer needed the hand of God. You had material forces of causation. So do you need a God anymore to cause things when you can see material forces causing things? I hope I've answered your question, Angelina.
Yes, you have, but I would just like to add then that according to your answer, then, I mean, the ancient Greeks kind of have this, at least at some particular point in terms of their cosmic configurations of the universe, life, meaning, etc., that they didn't have this kind of absolute power guiding all of us. But then that could be said for all pagan cultures, right? But you're trying to say that because of this kind of age of reason that came about, that somehow it's this particular pivotal period. Okay, so I understand that. In terms of...
They were still a transactional sort of people. Mm-hmm. They supported the gods in a very transactional way.
I mean, again, in terms of Islam, actually, I'm guessing that, well, there's something that you didn't refer to, I mean, something that you said also before about taking over a vast area of territory. Certainly militarily they did, but when the Ottomans first came to the Levant, for example, 80% of the population was still Christian. It's when the Ottomans introduced a taxation on non-Muslims that people started to convert to Islam. So again, it comes down to monetary transactions, kind of spiritual bank accounts, if you like, connected to one's material one. So again, that's kind of also a little bit problematic in terms of what you said there, and also in terms of, let's say, the cosmic kind of dictatorship of the Ottomans. I mean, they were probably more plural than a lot of Middle Eastern Islamic regimes now. For example, the Ottoman Empire, you had 6 versions of the Quran that were accepted and formally circulating. But now, in 1921, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, some dudes in Al-Azhar decided to choose just one Quran, but there wasn't just one. So
I didn't realise that. I thought
No, that's again mythology, complete mythology. And there are certain Islamic societies until now that use different versions. But I mean, again, that's kind of that dictatorship of like one book, which was for some reason decided in the early 1920s in Cairo, is actually, the Ottomans in comparison look to be much more kind of free-willing and open to interpretation, actually, because
this was the trend in the 18th century. It was born again Islam, I forget Wahhabism or something like that, started to develop in the, and this was a very stringent Islam. This wasn't the Islam of the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, which was a bit, as you said, pluralistic, a bit easier going and not so intense. Mysteriously, in the 18th century, we have in the Islamic world a revivalism into fundamentalism. This happened. This was at the same time was happening in the Christian West. This was what they called the awakening. You can check it out in the 18th century, which revivalism came out of. So our fundamentalist Christians have their ancestry in the 18th century as well. Curiously, both at the same time. I suspect they were reacting to this sense of causation. They just didn't like it. It was undermining the basis of their faith.
True, but the difference, I think, I don't know for sure, but the difference between perhaps Christian fundamentalists at that time and Islamic fundamentalists is that those Islamic fundamentalists were made the power base of one of the richest territories in the region, thanks to foreign powers.
Okay.
Anyway.
Well, you could always give a talk in the atheist medium via Zoom or something like that. John's always looking for speakers.
Why was the Middle Ages so cruel?
In which part of the planet? Oh, okay, Europe. Well.
At this stage, Christianity was an extremely cruel religion.
Probably softens people's behaviour compared to what they could have been. From my understanding, when I've researched ancient cultures, that when it came to, say, the barbaric pagan cultures, the Christians are positively nice. Even if you don't like the Christians, the fact is you wouldn't want to meet some steppy barbarians. I mean, the Christians might torture you as a punishment. The steppy barbarians did it for fun. These were very harsh and, yes, by our standards, very brutal times. These were times that were dependent on the lower echelons of human and animal labour doing all the heavy lifting. Today, we've got machines. They didn't have that. A good chunk of the population had to keep their heads down. And if they didn't keep up the work, they got their backs hit with rods or with whips. For example, we take slavery. Slavery was quite normal because this was the only way they could make their societies work, or at the very least, indentured servitude. The master might have lived a reasonable life, but his many servants or slaves felt the harshness of life much worse. That's just the way things were. You know, how do you cut the weed in the fields? You really have to push people to get the work done. You have to work them to the bone. Well, you, of course, a master, and I'd want to be a master. You know, I want to have all the comfort. But this is most of the population lived the life, as they said, was short, brutish, and cruel. And I would say Christianity and even many other religions actually probably made it a bit less vicious than it would have been.
I can offer something on that. They've lived in an age where they didn't have scientific knowledge, and they thought that anything bad that happened was punishment from the god. So it was kind of, and they had the power to enforce their doctrines. So they thought it was a good thing to do to community benefit. Well, another hypothesis that I've heard is that they're copying the Muslims. Well, I think after the Andalusian period, where there was a lot of liberal debate and so forth, then there was a crackdown, and because there was obviously some interaction between the Christian world and the Muslim world at that time, and so I think that the way Islam was applied during the Christian Middle Ages was quite analogous to the way that Islam was applied as well. Well, I think maybe we've come to the end of our question sessions. Thank you again to Steve. Now, next month we have Nick Sikron, and he's going to be talking about the evolution of ethics, and we will look forward to that. So, yeah, thank you for everyone joining us tonight, and look forward to seeing you again, and especially the newcomers to our Zoom meeting.
Thank you very much.